Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Contra Mundum. And this week we're going to begin as usual with news from the Persecuted Church around the world, and then we're going to look a little more closer to home and to the state and nature and level of persecution of the church here in the West, which of course may come as a surprise or revelation to some, because there are believe it or not, people who think that the church in the West is not persecuted, but in fact it is, and it's just a little more insidious, although it is becoming a lot more blatant. But anyway, more of that later. So as I say, we'll begin first with news from the Persecuted Church globally. So our first news report begins from China. A house church mums group in Xiamen are told to stop gathering. This from the 18th of December today. Police told a mums group from a disbanded house church in China's Xiamen city to stop gathering, for they, to quote, host people who conduct religious activities. According to Sun Xiding Church's pastor, Yang Zibo, 9 mothers gathered at someone's home last week along with their children to share about their lives. On December the 17th, a policeman with the surname Zheng and his colleague from Wukun police station came and visited the host and asked them not to host anybody anymore. Pastor Yang said on his Facebook, to quote, a few days ago, the United States had just sanctioned the head of this police station for his oppression against Falun Gong, yet they refused to clean up their act. In addition, nowadays they are working closely with the Religious Affairs Bureau to disband 3 gathering venues of house churches. This was not the first time the Sun Xiding mums group was harassed by the police. In last August, there was a raid that took place at the same family's residence. While Xiamen, the port city in China's Fujian province, has been relatively tolerant to Christian activities, in recent years local authorities have intensified religious persecution against groups that are not state-sanctioned. News from Egypt today. After years of delays, the Egyptian courts have acquitted 3 men charged with assaulting an elderly Coptic Christian woman, Suan Tabet. These charges were brought after they participated in a mob attack against the Christian community in the village of Al-Qarm. They were accused of attacking, beating, and publicly stripping Suad. All of this followed allegations that Suad's son had an affair with a divorced Muslim woman. It was a situation that sent shockwaves throughout Egypt's entire Christian community. Though they have long experienced persecution and violent attacks, the nature of the assault on Suad was deeply impactful for everyone, especially, of course, Suad. An acquittal, after so many years of judicial delays, verifies to the Christian community in Egypt that though they are citizens, they are not protected by the law. It creates a sense of isolation and frustration by discouraging Christians to report incidents of persecution to the authorities. There is no doubt anywhere that what Suad experienced was sexual assault. The authorities need to hold those responsible accountable. Yesterday, news from Nigeria. 3 people were killed in Makurdi, the capital of Benue State, on December 16th. The 3 individuals included a well-known lawyer, his wife, and a local man who was blind. The victims were identified as Moses Udam, Mrs. Nekichi Udam, and Niyiko Mazugu. Another local named Amaati told The Punch, quote, "The gunmen, who spoke English and Fulani languages, stormed the community between 11 p.m. and midnight." Close quote. He continued to the reporter that, quote, "The first place they visited was the thatched house of the old blind man, where they killed the elderly man. It was his children who were able to escape that raised the alarm." Ati says that he only survived the attack by hiding in the roof of his home. When the militants came to his house, his children told the men that their father was away. In response to this attack, Governor Ortom stated that he would not be intimidated into repealing the anti-opening grazing bill in Benue. He believed that this attack and many others that have taken place are due to Fulani being upset about the bill that was put in place in late 2017. The bill makes it illegal for herders to move their cattle through open or federal lands while grazing. It requires the herders to buy land to ranch their cattle on. Despite this bill, attacks have continued in the state, though at a slower rate than previously. Please let us continue to pray for Christians throughout Benue and the rest of Nigeria, that they may remain safe for the rest of this holiday season. News from India. According to Morning Star News, a Christian pastor was beaten unconscious and left locked in a room to die by radical Hindu nationalists in India's Bihar state. On October 5th, Pastor Shelton Vishwanathan was attacked by 6 nationalists as he was distributing gospel tracts in Tiriyani village. According to Morning Star News, the nationalists confronted Pastor Shelton and told him to quit handing out the tracts. After Pastor Shelton agreed to their demands, the nationalists attacked. The men seized the keys to Pastor Shelton's scooter, took away his phone, and physically assaulted him. The last thing Pastor Shelton recalled happening was the nationalists were threatening to offer him as a sacrifice to their God as they beat him. Quote, "They punched my back and told me that they would offer me as a sacrifice to their deity as a punishment. They struck severe blows on my head so that I soon fainted." Close quote. When Pastor Shelton regained consciousness, he was locked by himself in a dark room. Quote, "I shouted for help, but nobody could hear me. I was lying down on the floor without food or water for the next few days. They did not give me anything to eat or drink." Close quote. After several days, an elderly woman who lived nearby heard Pastor Shelton's cries and released him from the room. The elderly woman told Pastor Shelton the door was bolted from the outside, and she was scared the nationalists would come after her if they found out she released him. He said, quote, "Had she not helped, I would not be alive today. I fully believe that it was God who sent her to help me." News from Armenia. 2 elderly Armenian Christian men were beheaded by Azerbaijani armed forces and have been identified. They were residents in the villages of Madatashen and Azoko in Nagorno-Karabakh. The first victim was named Gennady Petrosyan. He was 69 years old and was from Madatashen. He escaped Azerbaijan to Nagorno-Karabakh in the late 1980s, a decision that corresponded with Armenian pogroms in Azerbaijan during the late 1980s, early 1990s. The second victim was named Yuri Assyrian, who was 82 years old and was from Azoko. Both men were civilians. Hundreds of videos have emerged of violent war crimes committed by Azerbaijani armed forces against the Armenian community. These crimes bear a striking resemblance to tactics used during the 1915 genocide against Armenian Christians. Indeed, Turkey, who supports Azerbaijan during this conflict and who was the main instigator of the 1915 genocide, has made it clear through rhetoric that this conflict is driven by a desire for Turkish Islamic expansionism. Azerbaijan has arrested 4 servicemen accused of war crimes, not these 2 crimes specifically, but also seeks to distract from international pressure by making comparisons to the actions of other countries. Azerbaijan needs to take responsibility for its own instigating role in the conflict and for its own crimes before pointing at others. It is also important to note that Azerbaijan ranks 168 out of 180 on press freedom index, whereas Armenia rates 61 out of 180. Today, news from India. On December 8th, a pastor from India's Jharkhand state was shot dead by unidentified assailants. Although the motive for the murder has yet to be officially established, The family of the slain pastor claims he was killed for his faith. According to local sources, the slain pastor was identified as Pastor Salim Stephen Surin. Pastor Surin was a part-time evangelist in Jharkhand's West Singhbhum district and ran a small shop in the village of Rania to support his wife and 2 children. On December 8th, Pastor Surin and his wife, Tarsis Surin, traveled to Putikda village because 5 people had expressed their desire to be baptized. After visiting the Christians in Putikda, Pastor Surin and his wife traveled home on the couple's motorbike. Along the way, the couple was stopped by 3 unidentified individuals who shot and killed Pastor Surin. Mrs. Surin says, quote, "They killed my husband in front of my own eyes. I was terrified seeing my husband collapse, having been shot in the chest. I started to think about my children and loudly cried out to God to save me and take care of my children. I pushed the man who was pointing the gun towards me. I ran into the thick bushes and the nearby forest. I probably walked for more than 10 hours to reach my home. I purposely did not take the road to avoid the attackers." After Mrs. Surin escaped, the unidentified assailants fled the scene of the murder. At approximately 5 p.m., Pastor Surin's body was discovered lying on the road by local travelers. Local Christians report there have been multiple threats issued against Christians in Putikda village. According to one source, the Christians of Putikda have been told they must renounce their Christian faith. Despite the threats, Pastor Surin continued to visit Putikda and support its Christian community. A murder case was registered by police, and an investigation has been opened to look into the matter. News from home. Chelsea footballer raises funds for persecuted Christians. Premier League footballer Olivier Giroud has taken part in an online fundraising gala for the Persecuted Church. Giroud auctioned off his national French jersey, won on his 100th match with the national team, and the T-shirt worn in Chelsea's 2020 FA Cup final. French-speaking church, French Connect London, organised the event in partnership with Plus que Sportif to raise funds for projects in North Cameroon, the Maghreb and Mali, supported by the charity Open Doors and Holistic Sports France. According to Open Doors, there are currently 300 million Christians persecuted around the world. Speaking at the gala, Giroud said, "It is unimaginable to see so many persecuted Christians in the world today. It is incredible to have numbers like that. We have to talk about it." Close quote. The T-shirts of French footballer Aurélien Collin, Major League Soccer champion in the United States, Astrid Ungoan, French handball champion, and others also went under the hammer. In a tweet, Joel Thibault, one of the organizers of the event, said, "Thank you all. The amount of the 2019 gala has been greatly exceeded." Well, there we are. So that's the very latest news from the Persecuted Church. Please, of your charity, keep our brothers and sisters in the faith elsewhere in the world in your prayers. Don't forget them during this season of Christmas tide. Remember that the whole reason for the season is salvation. Let us pray that they may be comforted, that they may be consoled, that the humbling circumstances of the Nativity may remind them of God in Christ's own sharing in their experiences. Remember that the Holy Family themselves had to flee Bethlehem to go to Egypt from Herod. So please, of your charity during the Christmas season, keep our persecuted brothers and sisters in your prayers. So now we'll move on to our feature this evening. Contra Mundum Domesticatim. Domesticatim literally means at home. And now there are several different ways in which I could talk about this evening. And in the first instance, I want to address perhaps something that it seems many Christians are unaware of. And that is the nature and level of persecution that Christians are enduring here in the West. As we said when we began this series, part of the issue for us here in the West is the fact that so many Christians don't identify themselves with the persecuted church. And this is true in two respects. In the first, mainly and namely ignorance of the persecution that is going on elsewhere in the world. Many Christians here in the West have no idea, absolutely clueless about the suffering and the level of persecution, about the martyrdoms that are continuing on a daily basis elsewhere in the world. Remember that the British Foreign Office only last year commissioned a report that described the level of Christian persecution around the world as reaching genocidal proportions. Genocidal proportions. It's worth remembering, for example, that in the first decade of the 21st century, right? The 21st century, in the first decade, over 1 million Christians around the world were murdered, martyred for their faith. And here in the West, to be brutally frank, most had no idea, most not a clue that it's been going on. And so it's important to support the efforts of charities like Open Door and others who are trying to raise awareness here in the West of the plight of persecuted Christians elsewhere in the world, as well as trying to support Christians elsewhere in the world by fundraising and by political lobbying and campaigning. And this is something that all of us as Christians here in the West could get behind. There are, of course, so many calls upon our charity, we might say. And in these increasingly difficult times during COVID, it's perhaps the case that charitable giving, in terms of monetary giving, is going to become sparse and difficult. Nonetheless, there are other ways in which we can contribute to the effort to support the persecuted church elsewhere. And one of those ways is through lobbying our own politicians. If you go to websites like Open Doors or to International Persecuted Christians and others, you will find various campaigns, and they've even, they've provided the wording for you. There are template letters, etc., that you can simply cut and paste or forward to your member of parliament here in the UK, or to your senator or other representative elsewhere in the West. And the purpose of these campaigns is to persuade our governments to put pressure on the governments of those places where this genocidal persecution is going on. There are all sorts of ways that governments can pressure other governments. One is through sanctions, limiting exports and imports of a particular country from particular countries, of not supporting a particular regime's efforts within, for example, the United Nations or in NATO or other international organizations where governments come together. There are all sorts of ways, diplomatic ways, that governments can exert pressure on others. And for sure, for certain, we must surely wish, for example, here in the UK, that our own government will do its level best to exert some pressure on governments elsewhere where Christians are being literally murdered for their faith. We've reported each week news from the Persecuted Church around the world. We've looked, for example, at the situation in China, last week in the situation in Indonesia, where Salvation Army personnel were murdered, and were murdered by Mujahideen for being Christians. And, you know, it's interesting to note, for example, we will do a feature on Saudi Arabia. But for example, Saudi Arabia has, I'm not sure if it still does, but it did have co-presidency of the Human Rights Commission at the United Nations. Saudi Arabia, a place where it is forbidden to possess a copy of the Christian Bible. And the nature of corporal punishment within Saudi Arabia anyway is atrocious, but even particularly so for those considered apostates or infidels in comparison to the Islamic State religion. We will do a feature, as I say, on Saudi Arabia, or indeed some of the Arab-led states, and the kind and level and nature of persecution that Christians endure. It's not by all means all Arab states. For example, the United Arab Emirates has an excellent track record in human rights generally, and with regard to religious freedom. But places like Saudi Arabia, which of course do a lot of deals, a lot of trade deals, a lot of armament deals with the British government, with the American government, etc. It should be possible for our elected representatives to exert some kind of influence and pressure on Saudi Arabia to improve their human rights record. As I say, they are a member. I'm not sure if they still are. They were a co-president of the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations. They are obliged to, by that position and by being a member, they are obliged to uphold basic human rights, things like a fair trial, etc. So lobbying parliamentarians is something that and legislators is something that we as Christians, ordinary Christians who might think ourselves inconsequential, it's something we can do. We can write letters, we can send emails, we can badger our elected representatives to put pressure on our own government, encourage our own government to exert pressure on other places where Christians are facing acute persecution. To that end, there is an event coming up on the 13th of January in Parliament. It's the launch of the 2021 World Watch List, which is put together by Open Doors, which ranks in order the various countries and states around the world where persecution is ongoing. And the idea of the launch, which will take place virtually, usually takes place in the House of Parliament, but can't obviously because of COVID, but will take place online. And if you go to the Open Doors website, there is a link there where you can send your elected representative, your member of Parliament, an invitation to go and to watch that virtual launch event for the World Watch List, and make them aware of these genocidal levels of persecution of Christians around the world. So that's first. That's something, we as Christians in the West ought to do. We need to make ourselves more aware of what our brothers and sisters in Christ are suffering elsewhere, and we need to tell others what they are suffering, and we need to do what we can do to support them. Now, the second thing that's an issue. So the first issue there is that Christians in the West don't identify themselves with the persecuted church, mainly through ignorance. Secondly, Christians here in the West, again, don't identify themselves with the persecuted church, in part because they don't recognize themselves as being persecuted. And now, if you were to talk, as I have on a regular basis with Christians of various different denominations, if you were to ask them, is the church persecuted? Some of them, a very small number of them, may refer to persecution elsewhere around the world. Most of them would, and almost adamantly, say that the church is not persecuted. And certainly they would be adamant about stating that fact, or of stating that as a fact concerning the church here in the West. But the truth is that the Christian church here in the West is under attack, as in fact all religion is, all faith is. As some of you will know, I do a lot of work combating faith hate and dealing with faith hate crime here locally and feeding in nationally. And even in the hate crime statistics, 9%, so for the year 2019 to 2020, 9% of religiously motivated hate crimes in the UK were of Christians. Now, 9% doesn't sound very much, and 9% compared to the percentages of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, etc., 9% is not very much. But it's something. It's more than nothing. And that, of course, for it to be registered as a hate crime means an explicit and overt expression maliciously to a Christian about their faith. In order for it to be registered as a hate crime, it means that the police were persuaded, that the Criminal Prosecution Service, the CPS, were persuaded that the level and nature of religious hatred endured by that person was such that it constituted a hate crime. Now, of course, it is a little confusing here in the UK because we have hate crimes and we have hate incidents, and the two are not the same thing. The difference basically is that a hate crime is an event that is recorded as a crime and where criminal proceedings take place. So, in other words, somebody will be taken to court. They will be prosecuted by the CPS. A hate incident is just the registering of an event that is recognized as being hate motivated, but not to the level of a crime. So in other words, in the hate incident, there's not enough evidence to support a conviction for a hate crime. But nonetheless, hate incidents will be recorded. But the statistic that I'm talking about, 9% of hate crimes were of Christians in the UK. That means a hate crime. Literally, somebody was arrested and prosecuted. Now, the nature, of course, of hate crimes is wide and varied, and there are various criticisms, of course, about the definitions of hate crimes and hate incidents. Nonetheless, for a hate crime to have been committed, the police must have felt that there was significant evidence. And what this means in terms of expressions of hate or of a clear motivation by hate or through hate toward a Christian, that means threats of violence or actual assault. That means witnesses to name calling, to verbal assault. So, you know, it's serious stuff. And as I say, 9% doesn't sound a lot, but 9% of hate crimes, not incidents, hate crimes in the UK against Christians is not nothing. Now, of course, we should hope and we should pray that those figures, that figure doesn't rise. And it is true that overall there is now an easing off, or at least at the end of the recording period for 2019 to 2020, certainly hate crime had dropped some 5% across the UK. Hopefully that's still continuing. However, in my work and ministry here in Brighton, we've noticed a rise in religiously motivated hate crime and hate incidents, particularly during COVID, with particularly religious ethnic communities being targeted. So religious hate crime is something that we all, irrespective of our faith, that all of us should be aware of, and all of us should be combating and challenging within our own communities. So my point here is that, there is a level, perhaps very small, of overt or explicit persecution of Christians in the UK. And of course, that 9% of hate crimes is not going to necessarily portray the whole picture. Underneath that, of course, are a number of hate incidents, and then, of course, are all those other incidents that are not recorded, not reported. Underreporting of religiously motivated hate crime is currently a phenomena that myself and various agencies are trying to address, trying to encourage more people to come forward and inform authorities, both local authorities and community safety teams of the councils and local police, to tell them to report incidents of hate. But as I say, there is currently an underreporting going on. And this is across the board with all faiths, but also will be true, of course, for Christians. There will indeed, sadly, aside from hatred expressed by non-believers to believers, there are also, of course, hatred expressed between members and adherents of different religions. And that's, of course, something that we have to be conscious of, we have to be aware of. But this is, for example, an issue that is a problem amongst refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants. For example, of course, as many of you will know, because of the war in Syria and the difficulties across the Middle East generally since the beginning of the Arab Spring, and then, of course, Daesh and the ISIS Caliphate, lots of people left the region seeking asylum, and not just Christians, but also Muslims. And this can create difficulties where asylums are sharing space, and where, you know, there may be adherents of different religions, and one religion, of course, feeling that it was persecuted by adherents of the other. So there is, you know, another dimension, we might say, to religious hatred, is that hatred expressed between adherents of religions. Now, mercifully and graciously, generally here in the UK, that is not a significant problem, but certainly it is, again, a situation that exists. Mercifully here, the multi-faith and interfaith movements have ensured a good level of respect and tolerance by people of different faiths in the UK. So that's all good. That's all good. But nonetheless, as I've spoken before, there are discrepancies in the way that the law concerning religious freedom is applied in this country. And again, part of the problem there is that as much as Christians in the West generally don't seem to identify themselves with the persecuted church elsewhere, neither do they neither do they recognize themselves as being persecuted. And some of them too, and actually when I say some, I would say the vast majority of Christians here in the West have been very apathetic when it comes to asserting our rights as religious adherents under the law. We've become quite apathetic in terms of expressing our opinions and our views in the public sphere. Now, here, of course, is the irony, because the reduction in Christian voices in the political sphere and spectrum, to some extent, is attributed to a fear by some of sharing or talking about their views or perspectives or opinions from a religious perspective. As I said before, because there is an through the increase of secularization in our society generally, and in recent years particularly, growth in the humanist and atheist movements, that has, and then through a lot of negative incidents in the press, a lot of Christian voices, a lot of Christian people are shying away, Christian leaders even are shying away from talking publicly about their perspectives and opinions on various issues within our society. Now, some of those people are the same people who will say, no, the church is not persecuted here. Well, but, oppression, silencing, intimidation, being afraid to speak up, being afraid to share your opinion or your perspective in the public sphere, that is a form of oppression. And that betrays intimidation. And, Christians are being intimidated, do feel intimidated. They feel unable to express their views or opinions in the public forum. So that is an instance. That is, if you like, number one, as evidence for persecution. And persecution of Christians. Yes, on the one hand, all faith, we might say, is being challenged in our increasingly secularist society, but particularly the Christian situation is bad. By which I mean that, if you're of what is generally might be considered an ethnic based religion, like, for example, Judaism or indeed Islam, invariably people are more tolerant of even religious views or perspectives that run contrary to the prevailing zeitgeist. Likewise, you're also probably more able to publicly express or manifest your religion. By which I mean, very few people, for example, are going to attempt to prevent a Muslim from observing the 5 pillars of Islam and praying 5 times a day, even in a work situation. I've spoken about this before a few weeks ago. Here in the UK, and I believe the same is more or less true for the States, and certainly in Europe, a lot of offices, a lot of workplaces have prayer rooms. But those prayer rooms are not chapels. If you were to go into one such room, you will not find crosses or crucifixes. You will not find statues or pictures or postcards or other kind of iconography, because primarily those designated prayer rooms are for Muslim employees. And the companies and the government offices and departments that have created those spaces have done so to tick off check boxes for equality and diversity. When I worked as a civil servant in London, this was an established practice that during, for example, Ramadan, which is the Muslim season of fasting, akin somewhat to Christian Lent, they are practicing Muslims fast between sunrise and sunset. And between those times, they are not permitted to take any refreshment whatsoever, not even water. But as soon as sun sets, they're able to eat. Now, such was the accommodation made in the British civil service that for Muslim colleagues observing Ramadan, they were able to avail themselves of the flexible hours working system, so they could clock in earlier in the day, and they could observe their fast. They could work through lunchtime if they wanted to, but at the time of official sunset, they were allowed to occupy communal spaces and break their fast with an iftar, which literally a meal to break fast. And for this, many of them would gather together. But of course, the point I'm making is that Orthodox Christians, for example, observing Lent, aren't afforded the same kind of accommodations. And the issue there, of course, is that in part, as one judge said to a plaintiff, not all Christians observe the same practices. Nonetheless, we would have to say that, well, maybe that's true, but the same is also true of Muslims. There are different types of Muslims, and they observe there are variances in the way they practice their religion, just as in Judaism. There are Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews, and liberal Jews, progressive Jews. They will follow their religion in different ways. But you wouldn't dream of penalizing one over the other. Why then are Christians, generally not afforded similar accommodations, especially to observe high days and holy days? And why should it matter that there is a variance in praxis between different denominations? Now, part of the issue here, I'm sad to say, is that this kind of what I would call reasonable discussion that I'm suggesting hasn't been suggested or put forward by other Christian leaders in our nation. It seems never to cross their minds either to challenge anything or to support anyone in a challenge, let alone themselves try to propose or to work out or find a solution or an accommodation. And they tend not to avail themselves of the various legal routes that it is possible to take to assert one's rights under the law for religious freedom. And this is why it is left, generally it seems, to individual Christians who are experiencing various forms of persecution or various forms of discrimination, both in the workplace and in other public institutions. It's down to them to make a stand as individuals and take cases to court, and generally to do so without any noticeable kind of public affirming statement or support from Christian leaders generally. They are effectively left to get on with it by themselves. Invariably, the secularized press give these individual Christians a hard time. Often they are ridiculed. Often they are treated, disrespectfully. They are often deliberately misrepresented, or their views or perspective deliberately misrepresented, and they suffer greatly as a part of it. But they do so often by themselves. Some even are alienated by their own church congregation. And this is shocking. I mean, this is appalling. So what I'm going to do now is play a couple of films to give examples of the kind of situations that brave individual Christians are having to face on their own with very little support from Christian leaders in our nation nationally. So bear with me 1 second. So this first example is just a couple of years old. The video is about 6 minutes, but it's worth listening to and paying attention to. And I'm pretty sure that in watching and listening to what is said, you will find elements that you can relate to yourself.
What we're seeing today is a growing and troubling trend of intolerance and discrimination against Christians. Nowhere has that been more clear than in the case of Richard Page. Now, Richard was a magistrate, 15 years had existed.
Stop. Sorry, bear with me. This worked in rehearsal, I assure you. Let's try that again. Oh, I know why. There we go.
What we're seeing today is a growing and troubling trend of intolerance and discrimination against Christians. Nowhere has that been more clear than in the case of Richard Page. Now, Richard was a magistrate, 15 years, had an exemplary record of service. This is a guy who used his talents thereafter to also help an NHS trust. He's a man who, beyond supporting his own family, fostered numerous children. So this is a gentleman who gave back over and over and over again to the community, using his talents in a way that most people haven't. Yet society has branded him to be homophobic simply because he was doing his job. And that job was, in an adoption procedure, to determine what was the best interest of that child. And in his studied opinion, it was that children do best with a mom and a dad. So I have before me the two judgments handed out by the Employment Appeal Tribunal in his cases. The first is against the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Chief Justice, where they said that Richard was properly removed because he showed impartiality, which may have prejudiced the judiciary. And to that I can just say that there are people much higher in the hierarchy, the judicial hierarchy, who have shown similar prejudices but taken the opposite view, and instead of being punished, they have been applauded. Lady Hale, for example, has wished for the quickening of the end of the marriage culture by saying we need no-fault divorce. She said that in a newspaper article, which clearly showed her bias. It clearly showed how she would rule on the case, yet she wasn't punished. Similarly, the head of the family division came out and applauded different family models, including polygamy, yet that bias wasn't punished. Richard's issue was that he said something that was going against the cultural zeitgeist. That's viewpoint discrimination. I think when we look specifically to the judgments and we look at this characterization that Justice Chowdhury has made, that Richard has claimed that it is not normal, in quotes, for a child to be adopted by a single parent or a same-sex couple. That is a caricature of Richard's position. That's not what he said in closed chambers. Richard had been presented with a document which not only suggested that same-sex parenting was equal to heterosexual, to male-female parenting, but even better. And so it was his right and his duty as a magistrate to push back on that, saying, look, a mother and a father bring unique gifts to parenting. Social science, psychology, psychiatry, they all show that there are unique benefits to being raised by a mom and a dad in a low conflict relationship. So when we start playing politically correct doctrine and putting that over the truth, we're doing a disservice to children. Now, Richard is a guy who has fostered numerous children. He saw this in his day-to-day life, and he applied that reality to his position as a magistrate. We should be grateful for having people as brave as Richard sitting on the bench determining what's in the best interests of our child, when the rest of society seems so willing to throw him under the bus. We see in paragraph 7 of the judgment this chilling statement that the conduct panel found that Richard Page's beliefs had unreasonably affected his judgment and that he lacked insight, not appreciating or accepting that his beliefs prevented him from objectively considering same-sex adoption. I would suggest that that is an entirely Orwellian statement, that the idea that having to share the government orthodoxy of the day makes it impossible for you to see this quote-unquote truth that they're suggesting. The reality is that the only truth here is that a child does best with a mom and a dad. That is not a bias, that is a policy fact. Again, I think he showed a great deal of insight, and he showed a great deal of character that was in keeping with his 15 years of exemplary service as a magistrate. We have, in the other case, Richard being dismissed from the NHS Trust on the grounds that they're saying that his position hurt patient care in the sense that LGBT people suffer disproportionately from mental illness and therefore might not seek services from the NHS just because this one person who had a financial position in the trust made these comments. I can just say that's absolutely ludicrous. What the law says is that if you were to interfere with freedom of religion, it has to be done in a proportionate way and in a manner that's necessary in a democratic society. What the trust could have equally done was simply sent out a statement and say, Richard Page, we're aware of the statement of Richard Page. It is not necessarily the position of the trust. Richard's position is financial and has nothing to do with patient care. That would have served the purposes of democracy by being tolerant to Richard's view, which is ironically the thing that they are condemning Richard for not being, and it would have served patient care. So ultimately what we're seeing here is an illiteracy towards Christian belief. And we've seen that over and over again in cases where judges can't even see that a cross or why a cross has Christian meaning to a believer. And it's created a bar to profession. And we should all be worried when a court says that holding and expressing a belief is enough to prevent you from being either in office or working with a public body. And it's a principle that we can't stand by. We believe the law speaks to equality. It speaks to plurality. It speaks to the belief that in a democratic society, we can hold different positions and still live peacefully, that it is our differences that bring us together, and not this idea that the government can create a uniform morality that we all have to hold by. And Richard's case is worthy of appeal. I believe that we will win on appeal because the principles of religious liberty are so strong on this case, and they've been ignored at the lower level. And if we have to, we'll bring this to Strasbourg, where they have already said that employers must respect the right of religious adherence in the workplace, which they haven't done in this case.
So there, an interesting situation, interesting scenario. Incidentally, he lost the appeal. Now, I would have to say myself that his position was a reasonable one. It's been known for centuries that a family consists of a mother and a father. And generally speaking, of course, there's been wide variance in experiences, but overall, mostly positive concerning, the conventional nature of family and upbringing. Now, all he was positing was a different perspective, a different view, but one which, of course, ran contrary to the zeitgeist, the prevailing zeitgeist, and thus not only was he silenced, but in fact he lost his position as a justice of the peace, as a magistrate, and as a trustee of an NHS trust. Now this is ridiculous, especially when one considers, for example, what the Equality Act says about freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Now, of course, the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, Article 18, protects freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and as an enshrined right, protected by international law. But also, here in the UK, religious belief is a protected category in the Equalities Act 2010. Now, in the Equalities Act 2010, there are various protected categories that includes, for example, sex, male and female, that you can't be discriminated because of your sex. It includes disability, protection for disability, that you can't be discriminated against for being disabled, etc. And it also protects religious belief. And this has been tested in the courts, so that any philosophical belief that is genuinely held and not just an opinion or viewpoint based on the present state of information available about a weighty and substantial aspect of human life and behavior. Let me just explain that. So according to the Equalities Act, and according to case law, or some case law, the Equalities Act protects any philosophical belief that is genuinely held and not just an opinion or viewpoint about a weighty and substantial aspect of human life and behavior. And this is the point that the presenter there was trying to make, and that should have received a fairer hearing and consideration in the law, in the case regarding Richard Page. Clearly, what Mr. Page was advocating was not a minority view, not a minority opinion, but to some extent, even if it were, it doesn't matter. He is entitled to hold that opinion and to express that view. That's what freedom of religion, conscience, and thought means. And not forgetting that this protection under the Equalities Act 2010 also extends to non-believers as well. So, if a secularist or an atheist or a humanist felt that they were being discriminated against because of a sincerely held belief or opinion, they too are protected by the Equalities Act, and likewise could take someone to court, perhaps an employer for discrimination. And I think that's an important thing to appreciate, because as we were saying, so many Christians feel afraid to speak up publicly. I mean, I have to say that even doing this broadcast, I have to, I'm what's the word? I'm consciously thinking about the presentation, thinking about my words, trying to, making sure that what I say is accurate. And also that what I say can't be misconstrued or misrepresented. This is the kind of sense of intimidation and oppression that religious people, and particularly Christians, feel. Well, this is what we're enduring. Okay, let's look at another example. And this is particularly pertinent, or germane, shall we say, to the previous video. So bear with me again 1 second.
Now, you are not welcome, okay? I'm coming back, sir. Get up! You're hurting my arm. Why are you hurting my arm like this? You don't need to do this, sir.
Last decade has been crazy, really. Steadily getting worse from authorities and sadly an element of the general public. There are windows of grace and quietness from the police and the authorities, and then it all kicks off again. I'm not stupid. I'm ex-soldier, so I'm aware of the wiles of the world.
I think with the way things have gone over the last 10 years, a lot has changed. But ultimately, the hearts of men are still the same as we go through time, since the beginning of time. We're born in sin.
Do you believe the Ten Commandments are the most important Ten Commandments there are?
And you're just seeing it acted out more, I think.
And they crucified him. A man said to me earlier, no wonder they crucified Jesus.
We know Satan rages against those who preach the gospel and are bold and fearless with it and love people, and they're not taking on Mike over. They're taking on the Almighty, the Creator of all things. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, and save even some of the police.
We've socially started to accept a lot more sins in the last, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years with things like abortion and same-sex union, making it more acceptable, and anyone who says anything biblical against their beliefs or views are labeled bigotry and homophobic and things like that.
My dynamic is very simple concerning the police. When they behave themselves, they have my respect. When they don't, they have nothing.
A lot of the police that I have seen, even on both sides of the pond, is that a lot of them are not well trained in the rights of free speech. And a lot of times, when you talk to them and reason with them, a lot of times they'll understand where you're coming from and, why you're able to do what you do. I still feel they need to be trained a little bit better on both sides, and not always respond to how people are reacting to us, but they should be responding to what's the law and what we're able to do.
So obviously you get the damages. It pains me, and I know it pains my fellow brothers to be having to take the police to court on this. For a change, to have the judge rebuke the police. This never happens.
To be able to freely go and stand in the public square and proclaim the word of God without hindrance.
And the police should have immediately given damages, like they do in most cases when they're found guilty of such things. They lose.
The highs and lows of how you look at it, we know that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. So we go out there with the hopes that we can freely do what we do. I think that the church, a lot of times, they look at the response of the public towards us, and because the response may not be pleasing to what they think it should be, they think that somehow that we're doing it wrong. And I think that they have to understand that if you're going to boldly proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, you're going to get people that are going to come against you.
This is not a personal vendetta from myself against the Avon and Somerset police. They have a personal vendetta against me, and that's obvious from the evidence over the years.
My name is Christy, and over a year.
Having a wife with me. Be blessed by the Lord to have angels stand by my side, and to have Christian concerns stand by my side. But first and foremost, my wife. My Lord stood by my side as well. The greatest victory is to still be out there on the street. They've not succeeded.
As a Christian, I've learned that we're to be kind even to police officers as they approach us, to be gracious, be kind to them, hoping that I can win them to Christ even as I speak to them. So I learned that it's better to be gracious and kind in the midst of even what might be persecution.
So there you go. Now that case was in 2016, and as I understand it, only this year they were eventually agreed compensation for the rough treatment that they received from the police officers, as we saw in the video and photos there. Really quite shocking behavior. But what was interesting, of course, was what one of the commentators said toward the end about basically the lack of support from churches and from Christian leaders who are influenced by the negativity that they see in the, for example, the crowd's response in those videos, and basically, shy away then from wanting to experience or attract any of that negativity toward themselves. And this, of course, occurs at the expense of the truth. Now, I find it necessary to say that whilst the subjects of the content of what those street preachers was discussing may by some be regarded as controversial, what those street preachers were saying, so what they were actually saying, was not. And again, there are numerous other examples that I could play where the street preacher concerned, they're not being deliberately provocative in what they're saying. They're not loudly condemning anyone. They're not loudly judging anyone. They are for sure expressing truths found in Scripture. Literally, this is the thing: is that literally what seems to cause the most problems is when they actually quote the words from Scripture itself, but they're not themselves being, deliberately obnoxious and not being rude, as you could hear then, even in those clips of the arrests taking place. Despite the rough treatment that they were receiving, they were still polite, respectful to the officers concerned. They still addressed them as sir. It's really quite ridiculous, really, that these incidences and these cases have been conflated in the way that they have. And again, the point is that under the law, strictly speaking, under the law, no reason at all. There's nothing wrong with what they were doing, how they presented themselves, and what they were saying. But this is an issue. This is an issue. I'm going to play another clip now. I did have this ready, and then I clicked something I shouldn't have, but it shouldn't take me too long to sort it out. So bear with me 1 second. Okay, now I suppose, officially, or not officially, but I suppose I should say there might be images in this video that some viewers might find disturbing. The fact that it's on YouTube, I would suggest that it's not that bad. So, but I suppose I ought to just say that in advance.
For the last has been waging a campaign of intimidation.
Sorry, let me just take that back. Here we go.
For the last 6 days, an organisation calling itself the Centre for Bioethical Reform UK has been waging a campaign of intimidation and harassment against myself and my constituents in Walthamstow.
The general public were told that an MP was being targeted and harassed by an anti-abortion group. The general public weren't told that MPs working by proxy through the council to not only shut down political opposition, but to criminalise those who seek to oppose them peacefully.
Excuse me, no. I have no right to take away.
I have no right to take away. No, because this is our property.
Stella Creasy repeatedly filled the airways with false allegations that CBR UK were engaging in a form of harassment, intimidation, illegitimate protest and inciting of violence. If that was true, we would have been bundled into the back of a police car before our feet touched the ground.
Everybody has a right to tell an argument, but there are ways that you can make your case without intimidation and harassment. And this organisation failed those tests.
How can a campaign that simply shows what an MP stands for be perceived as hateful? All we were doing was showing the policy that she supports.
A few months ago, this image was put up in Walthamstow. Do you think it's offensive?
No, why it should be offensive? No.
Okay. It cannot be a functional, healthy democracy if MPs are allowed to decide who criticises them, how they criticise them, and when they criticise them. That's why everyone, regardless as to whether they're Christian or not, needs to pay careful attention to this case. So here we are in central Walthamstow. We thought it was necessary to display here in Walthamstow because the MP for this constituency is pushing the most liberal, the most deadly abortion law Europe has ever known.
We came here because the people of Walthamstow need to know the humanity of the unborn child and the tragic reality of abortion and the fact that their MP, Stella Creasy, wants to remove all legal protections from the unborn child, meaning that abortion will be available up to 28 weeks for any or no reason. So this is where we did the display, just here. We thought it was a good spot right in the middle of the market. We've got the station that way, the shopping mall that way, and we've just got a lot of people walking by. So it was a prime location. And we always have to have our banners backed up against the wall so that you don't get people walking behind the banners. And so, yeah, we backed up here.
Over the last 3 years, I've done over 61 displays in loads of different London boroughs. I have never been closed down by the police or by local authorities, even when I've done displays outside of abortion clinics. This particular incident marks a turn because suddenly it feels like local councils are being able to use arbitrary powers to close down political opposition and worse, to criminalise them. This is really bad for free speech, and if there is no free speech in this country, there can be no social justice for the most vulnerable.
For the last 6 days, an organisation calling itself the Centre for Bioethical Reform UK has been waging a campaign of intimidation and harassment against myself and by extension my constituents in Walthamstow. From turning up in our town centre with a 20-foot banner of my head next to an image of a dead baby, to buying from Clear Channel billboards advertising in my constituency, displaying graphic and scientifically incorrect pictures of fetuses near to schools, to their Stop Stella campaign, which explicitly encourages people to target me as a hypocrite for being pregnant and advocating for the right of all women to choose when to be.
Of course, our campaign was targeted on the person Stella Creasy because she is the architect of radical and deadly abortion legislation. Okay, it's not wrong to focus your campaign on a particular person. People do it the whole time. Stop Boris, stop Corbyn, stop Mogg, stop Hunt. You know, these are all campaigns that have been run. Hashtag them, you can find them on Twitter. But when we did it on Stella Creasy, with her abortion policy, suddenly because she was pregnant, because she deemed herself to be a vulnerable person, was able to kind of make it out as if she was a victim. When in reality, the true victims of abortion are unborn children, not Stella Creasy.
She did everything in her power to try and shut us down. We put a billboard up through Clear Channel, and she demanded on Twitter that they take it down. She said, take down this disgusting image. She apologised to her Twitter followers for showing a graphic image. This was an image of a 9-week living fetus. If Stella finds an image of a 9-week living fetus graphic, vile and disgusting, something is seriously wrong.
The event of October was a massive shock to me personally as a pastor of the local church. It comes more like a massive clampdown on the gospel of Jesus Christ.
So just to update you, what's happening is the council have issued some kind of paperwork that they've obviously put together overnight to try and get us to pull our display down.
After she succeeded in taking the billboard down, her next goal was to remove us from Walthamstow. Senator Creasy did not want the reality of abortion shown in Walthamstow.
Excuse me, no. They have no right to take away. They have no right to take away. No, because this is our property. They have no right to take it away.
They issued Christian with a community protection warning, and they were now issuing him with a community protection notice. The community protection notice said that Christian Hacking could not come back to Walthamstow with images of living fetuses and dead fetuses.
We exposed Stella Creasy's abortion policy, and she tried to have us criminalised for doing so. Now, how can you push for abortion up to 28 weeks, and then when people actually show what that looks like, you have full weight of the law falling down on them? What is she hiding? And why is she able to get her council to close down political opposition to her?
Is it harassing to give a leaflet to someone? Is it harassing to have a conversation? Is it harassing to ask a member of the public, what do you think about abortion? And just discuss views. That's all we were doing. And also we were just showing what the MP Stella Creasy is standing for. So how can it be harassing to show this MP's constituents something that she's championing?
What CBR UK is doing, it's good, and it's a way of showing people in our community that this is the way that is right. And I'll repeat again, there is nothing controversial in this interview.
I'm very happy that we're appealing this CPN, and it's so important because it shouldn't be set as a precedent that views can be shut down simply because they're not maybe mainstream views, and criticism should not be criminalized.
The sanctity of life is biblical. The sacredness of life is biblical. And if we have a group who is giving total support to that, why is the church, the local church, not supporting that group doing the same thing? So it's a church issue, it's a biblical issue, and it's a thing that we must do. If we don't do it, we're not obeying the gospel. We cannot kill babies. We can't.
You see, there's a funny thing going on in Stella's mind, which is if you want a child, then it's a child, and you love it. And she does her own child, which thank God she gave birth to in December. But if you don't want a child, then it's totally okay to strip that child of all human rights, and it's called a safe, legal, and healthy abortion procedure. And if anyone tries to challenge you, close them down. And that's why this appeal is so important, because actually what's in this appeal isn't simply the right for us to educate members of Waltham Forest on abortion, but really it's challenging the right of politicians to define who they're criticised by, how they're criticised, and whether they have a right to close criticism down just because they don't like it.
Well, there you go. Now, CBR, I've worked with before. Their campaign is provocative. It has to be said, it's provocative. It's not controversial, but it is provocative. But I supported them. I attended a trial with them. They were taken to court here at Brighton Magistrates. It's almost 10 years ago now, and I was the only local Christian leader to stand by them in the court, and they had been arrested for displaying images such as you saw in the clips there outside an abortion clinic. And their modus operandi has always been to stand silently with pictures and allow abortion to condemn itself, basically. And they use a mixture of pictures, of graphics that in fact are medically accurate, that are sometimes of living fetuses, sometimes of aborted. But they don't harass anyone. They never harass anyone. They always film. They always have these little cameras that they wear deliberately, so that they've got footage of actually what has happened, so that if anyone does try to accuse them of harassing anyone or anything like that, they've got actual footage that shows how they were behaving and what was going on. And it was, again, a local MP here, Caroline Lucas, who tried to have their displays stopped. She wasn't the instigator of the trial, but she certainly was vocal in supporting those who were trying to prosecute. And I'm sad to say that my standing with CBR cost me. Well, it didn't cost me anything, but I became something of a well, for example, I was at the time co-founding a Christian mental health charity group to raise mental health issues in churches. It was an ecumenical venture, but my standing with CBR in defense of them in court meant that the other co-founders forced me, well, in fact demanded that I resign. So, you know, again, don't just ignore those who claim that you know, that no kind of persecution exists of Christians here in the West, because it does. And sad to say, as these Christians have demonstrated in these videos, sometimes even other Christians are the culprits, are the perpetrators of that persecution and of that negativity. And I can say that because I have directly experienced it myself. And, you know, and that's an issue. It's an issue because it means that people are being intimidated, and intimidation means oppression. And it does mean an attack on what are internationally recognized human rights. Not only that, but also rights that are supposedly protected by our own laws here in the UK. Part of the issue has been that you know, Christian and other faith leaders in this country have not made a stand, have not stood up and either asserted their rights under the law or sought to have and instigate a reasonable and rational discussion in the public forum. They've shied away from, they've basically been intimidated. They will claim otherwise, of course, but they have basically been, they are basically intimidated. That is the situation. That is why, for example, none of the Roman Catholic bishops, for example, in this country, are ever filmed talking about abortion issues. Don't know if you've noticed that, but you'd be hard pressed to find press footage of a Roman Catholic hierarch in this country talking about pro-life issues. Likewise, you'd be hard pressed to find, except unless it was a controversial case, you'd be hard-pressed to find footage of any significant Christian leader in this country talking in the public sphere about controversial issues like same-sex marriage, for example, or same-sex adoption, or trans issues. Unless they are speaking positively, they're not otherwise heard. And the great problem with that, of course, is that many Christians who would like to be clear about the truth and to have the truth, particularly as the truth from our perspective, discussed and presented, are continually disappointed. So this is, it is something of a real issue. It is a pressing issue. Now, I have more examples, and I'm not going to show them now, but perhaps in the new year. And again, still very much of a local Western context and experience, and a disturbing situation, disturbing trend that deserves, and I'm afraid, again, I may be putting myself on the line here, but I do think, if you present things reasonably and rationally and calmly, there's no reason why anything shouldn't be shared and discussed in the public sphere. So I'll bring this program to an end. I hope you found that interesting. I hope you found that informative, and I hope you found that provocative in the sense of food for thought and reflection. Perhaps you might be prompted to think about your own witness to Christian truth in our society, in our communities, amongst your friends, in your workplace, as well as at home. And what I will certainly look at in the next episode as well is the domestic context. So at home on this occasion meant at home in the West. Next time we will look at home, by meaning literally in our domestic situations and contexts, because this is an area, for example, that many Christians experience difficulties. Families, as we all know, sometimes can be cruel, and it can indeed sometimes be difficult for Christians to witness, even in their own homes, even amongst what should be safe context. So even amongst friends, even amongst family, many Christians don't realize that what they are experiencing is a level of persecution, and it is a form of discrimination, and it is contrary to the law. Nobody of any faith, as I said earlier, the Equality Act is quite clear. Nobody should suffer discrimination, nor insult, nor mockery, nor anything else for sincerely held beliefs. But we'll look more into that next time. So bless you for watching. Obviously, next week will not be there will not be an episode because it will be Christmas Day, and quite frankly, I shall myself probably be asleep by this time on Christmas Day. That's invariably what happens, though my schedule is slightly easier this year. Nonetheless, it's quite full on at the moment. So there won't be an episode next week. The week following, of course, is New Year's Day. And there may be an episode of something, maybe not necessarily Contra Mundum, on New Year's Day. We might perhaps try to start the new year with an injection of positivity. But certainly the next edition of Contra Mundum will, again, be titled domesticatim and refer to literally the context of witnessing and the kind of persecution Christians might face and endure in the home, and some other controversial topics as well. As I said at the beginning of this show, please do pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters elsewhere in the world, particularly over Christmas. A little like Easter, this is often a time that some extremists of other persuasions choose to inflict atrocities. So please pray for the safety of our brothers and sisters elsewhere in the world, as they try to live simply as we are striving to live, simply as Christians, as lovers of Jesus, and as the beloved of God. So until then, meanwhile, take care, God bless, and remember, God loves you. And if I don't see you before, have a very happy, holy, and blessed feast of the Nativity. Take care and God bless.